All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Indie Lens pop-up series presented by Milwaukee PBS. How cool is this? This is like a book club, but for great documentaries, and our authors join us each time. I absolutely love it. I'm your host, Scottie Lee Meyers. I'm a producer here at Milwaukee PBS. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about this pop-up series. This year, we presented some really powerful films from Independent Lens, such as Move Me, Love in the Time of Fentanyl, and Storming Caesar's Palace. These films by independent filmmakers from across the country address some of the most important issues of our time and provide a richer understanding of society today. We're excited to introduce today's film, the film you just got done watching, Free Chol Soo Lee by Julie Ha and Eugene Yi, which tells the story of Chol Soo Lee, the Korean immigrant wrongfully convicted of murder, and who would ignite the Asian American movement. Free Chol Soo Lee premieres on Independent Lens on PBS on Monday, April 24th at 9 p.m. Central Time, 10 Eastern. Again, that premiere is on PBS on Monday, April 24th at 9 p.m. local time. Joining us today for the conversation part of this event, we have the film's two directors and producers. I would like to introduce first Julie Ha. Julie is a storytelling, her storytelling career spans more than 2 decades in ethnic and mainstream media with a specialized focus in Asian American stories. She formerly served as the editor-in-chief of Koram Journal, a national Korean American magazine. Free Chol Soo Lee, which premiered at the 2022 Sundance Film Festival, is her first documentary film. Also with us today is Eugene Yi. Eugene is a filmmaker, editor, and writer from Los Angeles. His editing work has been in Berlin Ale, which is, I believe, the film festival there in Berlin, Tribeca, and the New York Times. He formerly served as a contributing editor to Koram Journal, the aforementioned national Korean magazine, Korean American magazine. Free Chol Soo Lee is also his first film as a director. And for our final guest, it's Dr. Maysee Herr. Dr. Maysee Herr. Dr. Herr is the CEO of the Hmong, Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce, an organization that provides technical and financial assistance to entrepreneurs and business startups in historically underinvested and underbanked communities. Prior to joining that organization, Dr. Herr was an associate professor of education at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Love that area of the state. She co-founded a program to give youth the opportunity to learn how to speak Hmong and to understand Hmong culture and history. She's been part of diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting for a number of organizations and used that skill set for other grassroots groups to help facilitate community dialogues like we're having right here. Over the years, she has been recognized for many awards and lists as a top executive and influencer. So welcome, everyone. For those of you who are watching live, you have a great opportunity today to interact with our guests and ask questions. So please don't be shy. Submit your questions in the OV chat box, and we'll make sure to integrate them into our conversation. So please go ahead and do that. So let's get this conversation started. Maybe we'll start with you, Eugene. If you just kind of want to tell us when you first became aware of Chol Soo Lee's story.
Yeah, I was in my 20s when I became aware of the story, and it was through meeting the journalist that's kind of a central figure in the film, K.W. Lee, so whom I met during that period of time.
And Julie, let's just go around the room with each of you responding to that.
Yes, I actually learned about the case through K.W. Lee as well. I met him when I was 18 years old. I was doing an internship at a Korean American newspaper he had founded at the time. And it was the first time I had ever heard of it. And it actually, meeting him changed my life. He became my mentor of 30 plus years. And he's the reason I became a journalist and the reason I made this film.
And Maysee?
You know, sadly, I did not hear about Chol Soo until maybe just about 2 years ago. But, you know, when and to think that I taught courses in this. I actually taught a course in Asian American history and activism in college. But I did teach about Vincent Chin, right? I did know about him and some other historical events that happened. But Chol Soo was fairly new to me.
And I will confess that Chol Soo Stories, I wasn't aware until I found out I was going to be hosting this indie pop-up, conversation. And I'm so grateful for this film and for having more awareness about it. I would love to spend more time, maybe at the end if we have time, but KW Lee, oh my God, he must have been the most incredible journalism professor. I love that quote in the film where he says, journalism is comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. That is profound. What an incredible mentor. No wonder why he left such an impact on both of you. Speaking of KW Lee, the investigative journalist from the Sacramento Union, who in many ways got so much of this started, he lamented that this story is not just an essential chapter in Asian American history, but an essential chapter in American history. Why do you think this story remained, and in some ways remains, despite, some of the exposure through this documentary and other films, sort of remains underground after all these years?
Yeah, or go ahead, Julie.
No, go ahead.
It's like Chol Soo himself would actually sort of talk about that every now and then as well. In the appearances he made towards the end of his life and in conversation privately, and he wondered whether it was just because the case wasn't as clean as other cases and his life story wasn't as clean. Maysee mentioned the Vincent Chin case, and that's the one that this case often gets compared to, because the Chol Soo case happened a little bit before the Vincent Chin case. But yeah, we sort of start off the film kind of with that idea. Chol Soo talks about how he was not an angel on the outside. He was a kid who grew up living by his wits, and he had a record before he was arrested for the 73 murder. And he struggled when he got out. He struggled with his addiction, struggled with just the after effects of the institutionalization, compounding all the trauma he'd been through in his life. And on top of that, just trying to live up to the hopes of the community and wanting to be this sort of figure for the community that he had become, the symbol. But so I think for him, he wondered whether that difficulty adjusting might have led to people knowing less about the case. But I think when we were putting the film together, obviously we couldn't shy away from any of that.
Yeah.
There's no way to tell the story without any of that. But I think for us, it was always important to really make sure that Chol Soo's voice and Chol Soo himself was at the center of the film, and that he was able to sort of tell his story. And it's been just incredibly gratifying to see that the way audiences have responded to that is by having just this tremendous amount of compassion for Chol Soo and just connecting with him as a person. And through that, just seeing, obviously seeing his flaws, seeing his faults, but also just sort of recognizing his strength and his charisma and his resilience and all the reasons why he was able to kind of inspire this movement. And
go ahead.
Yeah, no, and yeah, just to wrap up, we're just sort of grateful that means that this movement kind of can hopefully, be more recognized, be better known, take its rightful place in history, because we just think it's a story and a history that deserve remembering.
And that's a testament to your filmmaking, to the fact that people are absorbing it, and the clean, your observation that it wasn't a clean case per se. And I love that opening soundbite that you sort of start with, that I'm not an angel on the outside. At the same time, I was not the devil. And that kind of, I think, speaks to what you were just saying, Eugene. Julie, yeah, go ahead.
Scottie, I just wanted to add, in terms of, KW sort of lamenting that this case and this landmark movement was all but forgotten and not taught even in Asian American studies classes in our universities and colleges. And why is that? And I think we also need to do some self-reflection as an Asian American community and ask ourselves if sometimes we fall into our own model minority myth. And why was this narrative, why was it too messy for us to acknowledge that it happened? Because no matter what happened in terms of the outcome of Chol Soo Lee's life post-release, this was a successful social justice movement. It did overturn 2 murder convictions in the American criminal justice system, which any lawyer will tell you is quite impossible. It did for the first time bring together a very unusual alliance of people. It wasn't just college-age Asian American activists, but it was also these middle-aged Korean immigrants and also these Korean grandmothers that were showing up to these courthouse protests in their Korean traditional dresses. That is a movement we're not used to seeing in America, and you almost have to see to believe. And so that was, KW's lament. And I think, through this film, I think Eugene and I often talked about just wanting to make sure also that we challenged our own community in terms of the histories and stories that we choose to remember and acknowledge. Things didn't work out like a fairy tale, unfortunately, in this case. Even though the movement was successful, but that also just speaks to, other important issues that we as a community and as society need to talk about, including, the damage, the human damage incarceration does, as well as, how difficult reentry is and what kind of support we're offering to people who do reenter society after incarceration. So yeah, we just hope that this film actually allows us to acknowledge the full truth of our history, even when it's something that's messy. And also, hopefully, people will see the resonance for some of the most important social justice and issues of our time that we need to talk about.
And if I could add this piece too, as I was thinking about that's a great question. As much as I'm sad that it's only coming out now, that I'm just grateful that Eugene and Julie have created this film at this time. But I also feel as though right now we are at a time where we're more accepting of that. Doesn't matter if someone's an angel or a devil, we're all flawed individuals. Our lives are much more complicated than that. But the fact that it should never have happened, he should never have been incarcerated to begin with, is something I think that was really emphasized in the film, and makes it, I think, very relevant and I think appropriate for this time.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge our viewers right now. If you're watching on OV, go ahead and submit in the chat box. What kinds of Asian American narratives were you taught in school? What types of figures did you learn about? What types of events and incidents throughout American history and beyond? The Asian diaspora. What did you learn? Or maybe you didn't learn much. And let's have an honest conversation about that. So I'm going to challenge our viewers right now to do that as I sort of pose the next question. What I love about this film is what we're doing right now is having sort of this safe space for a dialogue about race and identity, about the legal system and the traumatizing impacts of incarceration. Just how important are these conversations? Are we, just maybe evaluate a little bit about how good of a job we're doing at facilitating them, and whether you've seen these types of things sort of move the needle at all and sort of creating empathy? I mean, do you have any sort of interesting anecdotes about sort of rolling out this story and other stories?
Well, I mean, yeah, Eugene and I have been lucky to have spent all of last year, taking the film around the country, as well as abroad, in London and also in Korea. I think what we found is, I think one of our goals was actually to help people acknowledge and realize that there are, stories of incarceration, stories of the criminal justice system and racial profiling. Those are actually our issues too, as an Asian American community. Our film's narrator, his name is Sebastian Yoon, and he's actually formerly incarcerated. He's Korean American, and he does a lot of public speaking about his case because he actually was allowed to attend a college program from prison while incarcerated. And when he does that public speaking, he's talked about how he often feels like the lone Asian, in those spaces, which are primarily Black and brown. And so I think we had hoped that our film could make people realize, that these issues, these criminal justice issues, again, are our issues too, that there are incarcerated Asian Americans, that there are, some of the most pressing issues of our time are Asian American issues as well. I know Sebastian, he actually has come with us to some of our screenings, and has spoken quite powerfully, for example, about recidivism, and just how, he'll say how 50% of those who are released from prison within 3 years, oftentimes they go back to prison. With the program he attended called the Barred Prison Initiative, that recidivism rate goes down to 3%. And he's talked about sort of the impact of offering high quality education to people who are in prison, and also just giving people second chances, and realizing that, do we deny the people in prison, even if they are guilty of crimes, that humanity, that compassion, that second chance? Do we want, and I often say too, like, when we think about it, like, the vast majority of people who are in prison are going to come out one day, and so do we want them to actually have a fighting chance to become productive members of society, or do we want them to learn to be better criminals, and return to prison? So yes, those definitely, I think we've seen actually in our screenings, there have actually been like people in the audience who are formerly incarcerated or are family members of formerly incarcerated Asian Americans, and they have expressed that they sort of finally feel seen and heard, through the story of Chol Soo Lee. And so that's been quite powerful to hear.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that point about how anecdotes about how this is facilitating powerful conversations?
I could say that I was sad when I was reflecting on how talking about or learning about Asians being incarcerated, Asian Americans being incarcerated, how that was different from anyone else of a different background. And I realized sadly, I don't remember the last time I've seen a film of any kind of another Asian person being incarcerated and getting that perspective. So this was, I think, very powerful for that very reason alone.
We did have a comment here. I challenge folks to kind of chime in about what they've learned growing up. We have a comment here. Someone says, I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment. A great high school teacher taught me about Yuri Kochiyama's friendship and solidarity with Malcolm X. So that's a great comment. Again, folks, if you have questions, please do submit those. We kind of touched about the incarceration point. That really hit home for me when I watched this documentary. Some of the testimony from Chol Soo about how it destroys your spirit and your mind. KW's line about, hey, can I bring you some kimchi? Because even animals at the zoo can have their favorite food once in a while. And Chol Soo has to say, sorry, I don't think that's permitted here. I mean, oh my God. What do you think? What does Lee say himself about, what prison does to someone's humanity?
Oh gosh. Well, I think, there's the line even towards the end of the film, where at the funeral, where KW Lee, stands up at one point at Chol Soo Lee's funeral, and he's clutching this Buddhist monk's walking stick that Chol Soo had actually carved for him out of a tree, and he's quite emotional, and he says, Chol Soo died 100 deaths, right, in prison, but then he died 1,000 deaths, in so-called freedom. And so I think that sort of, distills, the experience of those in prison, and just the damage that it does. Even our, and we should remember, Chol Soo was actually incarcerated in California prisons at a time when the gang violence was at an all-time high. As we see in the film, he was in an altercation with a neo-Nazi inmate, which resulted in that person's death. But it was a kill or be killed environment. And so it was only but it was not only the prison violence. And this is something actually that our narrator, Sebastian, often emphasized to us. And he actually worked with Eugene and myself on the script for what Chol Soo says in our film, which are based on Chol Soo's writings and what he his interviews. But that's what he told us. He's like, it's not just prison violence that really destroys you in prison. It is the loneliness. It is the isolation, the depression, the constant dehumanization. And that's sort of the larger battle, actually.
And I would just add, for folks who are interested in learning more specifically about what Chol Soo went through, his memoir is a tremendous, just, my God, the amount of detail in it. And it grew out of kind of this wonderful act of encouragement from KW Lee, sort of encouraging Chol Soo to sort of write down his story. And you know, it's the granularity and the degree of detail you see in there just really takes you in. And I just really encourage folks to take a look and just do a Google search and look for the memoir. It's really powerful text. And yeah, one of the things that I think Julie and I always knew that we had to kind of use as at least one of the sources for some narration or source material, because there is an interiority that you get of what he went through that would not be otherwise available. And he sort of talks about that too, because his public face had to be this face that was encouraging to the people on the outside. He didn't want to discourage people, but he just went through so much.
Yeah, I can't even imagine that survival mode, that constantly being on edge. I mean, there's been research now that has emerged about sort of that constant state of fight or flight, that vigilance to violence can alter brain chemistry, literally. It's, you know, you mentioned sort of the gang violence that was maybe breaking out in Chinatown and San Francisco in the 70s. I wonder, much like stop and frisk today, I mean, were civil liberties of Asian Americans in those places just was it spilling over and being disrespected by law enforcement?
I mean, from what we've heard, and you know, we didn't investigate, you know, fully, like that wasn't the focus of our film, but we did, you know, for the historical context, we did do some research and talk to people about what the environment was like at the time. And, you know, we did hear, like, it was not uncommon for Asian youth to be picked up at the time by police and, you know, taken in or even, you know, wrongfully convicted. So it was, you know, there was a lot of pressure, I think, at the time by the city and the mayor on the police department, you know, to make arrests, because there were so many gangland murders that were going unsolved, and it was starting to affect tourism. And, you know, Chinatown tourism is actually considered, you know, at the time, the lifeblood of San Francisco at the time. So it was a big concern. And we, you know, apparently it was not uncommon for a lot of, especially Chinese youth, to be harassed in this way.
Yeah, Chris Chow, one of the journalists we spoke to, who sort of helped fill in some of the historical context, and who actually kind of he reported on the 1973 murder itself as a television reporter. You know, I mean, this used to be in the film, and it ended up not making the cut. But he talked about how, you know, you're Chinese and if you have long hair, like, you must be a gang member. That was kind of the harassment that he sort of said that shared with us that was going on at the time. So I think that gives you a sense of what the relationship between the community and the police was like.
Or the sad irony that a police officer identified Chol Soo as sort of the Chinese suspect when he was one of the lone Koreans in the area, right? So we see all these arenas in which diversity just makes for better work, be it a more diverse newsroom. Had we had more KW Lees, perhaps we would have got to Chol Soo earlier. If we had a more diverse police force, perhaps we wouldn't have seen some of the legal problems that we saw. If we see more diverse storytellers, perhaps we would be amplifying stories like we are seeing with Free Chol Soo Lee. We got a great comment here. I'm gonna scroll up and get to it here. Oh no, comment from the audience. Here we go. Something I loved about the film, says this viewer, was how it illustrates the humanity behind the symbol, how Chol Soo Lee grappled with becoming a symbol while trying to also reclaim his humanity. I worry sometimes in AAPI, advocacy and storytelling, that we put certain stories on pedestals and mythologize them to point that we lose the nuance and complexity, or we flatten them in order to be more digestible and legible to a non-API audience. So the question is, I'm curious if you can speak to how you see this story and your particular style of storytelling contributing to the work of community and movement building on a more authentic and honest grounds.
Well, I think, we should probably mention, I think, Eugene and I, we started first working together because we share a passion for telling sort of complicated, messy stories about Asian Americans and doing it with nuance and depth. That's, essentially why we had initially worked together as journalists for the Korean American magazine that you had mentioned earlier. And so, when we decided to make a film, I'll say it was very, the reasons that were very personal. We didn't necessarily think we're going to make this film to contribute to movement building. I think we have that passion for storytelling of Asian American stories, and this particular story happened to be something that I couldn't get out of my head after attending the funeral of Chol Soo Lee. And if you saw KW Lee stand up and speak and say those passionate words that we talked about earlier, then I think you would understand why he was so upset. And also, he at the funeral, he also lamented why this story was not known today, why this movement was not known. And so, I think we told this story and approached it this way because I think that's why we tell stories. And we also, I have to say, I think for us, because this is actually a very complicated story, and there were so many different directions and approaches that we could have taken with it. Even the activists themselves in this movement, we often say each of them could have a documentary for themselves because they're incredible people. But we decided that we needed to stay true to our North Star, and that was to fully flesh out the story of Chol Soo Lee, from his birth to his death. And we wanted to make sure that through our film, in a way, he could find agency finally, and the man behind the movement could be known, and he could share his own truth in his own words. And also, in a way, the film became this vehicle for Chol Soo Lee to speak to all his supporters, speak to the many people who rallied to his side. And even though the movement became this incredible burden for him, we also think by the end of his life, he came to this kind of peace that he knew he was touched by some of the most incredible and compassionate human beings on the planet. He knew that there could be a very valuable legacy if people knew about the Free Chol Soo Lee movement, if people knew that a bunch of Asian Americans rallied to the side of somebody who was not a model minority, somebody who was not an angel. And yet they deemed him worthy, of their time, attention, love, and care. They deemed him worthy of a landmark movement. And so that's, that became our North Star actually for the film. And, obviously we hope that it does help people talk about movement building or provide that kind of inspiration for movements today, not just for Asian Americans, for others as well. Because sometimes I think it's so easy for us to get so cynical and feel hopeless with all the problems we're facing in society. But when you look at this movement, it's just so unlikely. Again, this unusual alliance of people who came together, and then again, doing the impossible, right? Overturning 2 murder convictions at a time, mind you, when Asian Americans had very little political power. So it makes you believe that people can do the impossible.
Yeah, that scene where they're singing the Korean national anthem at the courthouse really speaks to that. That was very powerful. You're talking about the humanity of the story too. That quote, I loved seeing Chol Soo at the sort of his later years and kind of finally going on the circuit to give lectures and speak. Out of the depths of the pain of someone else, humanity grows, and that humanity is given to you pure and unconditionally. What a quote that is. I'm sorry, Maysee, I think I may have stepped on your toes there.
No, I just something that's been on my heart and that really struck me was when, Chol Soo talked about himself. It's just very powerful how he was someone who was born into enormous pain. That just really struck me. Born into enormous pain time and again, without much choice. Yes. And to continue to want to fight for humanity. After humanity has been taken away from him time and time again. And of course, most of all, through incarceration in prison. And yet he comes out and still fights for humanity. Just isn't always sure how to do that. But sees how humanity works, and he himself, lives to try to give that to others. So, I think some of those were just some highlights that I wanted to make sure that were talked about and brought up because they really struck me during the film.
Yeah, we'll talk about that enormous pain that we see in his biography early on in his life. But there is a great comment here, sort of speaks to what do we talk about when we talk about Asian American stories? And this person says, it's interesting that the primary things I remember learning about are how Asian American persons have been oppressed by the United States government, and not positive stories, which we tell about communities, humanity, or the focus of significant individuals. I don't know, does anybody care to weigh in about sort of the fact that we don't see a panorama of, sometimes I think there's more awareness about the fact that, okay, media, you got to show more Black joy, but I don't know if we talk about that in the same way as we do with the Asian American community.
Yeah, I mean, there just aren't enough of our stories out there, full stop. It brings to mind, the novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen has talked about this idea of narrative plenitude, of just having enough stories for a community out there so that one story doesn't have to be representative and carry more weight than that story itself might be able to carry. And so, I think it's wonderful that we were given this opportunity and the support to be able to make this film and to make a complicated Asian American story that kind of does both of the things that this questioner is asking. And thank you for this comment. These comments have all been just really so thoughtful. But yeah, it shows how an Asian American person has been oppressed by the United States government, both in the form of the police and in the form of just the fact that his life, his early life, was just shattered by a war, an American war that happened in Korea. But also, there's so much in our story of these significant individuals, these incredible individuals who came together and were able to sort of forge this movement, as Julie said, this incredibly unlikely movement. At a time when the idea of Asian America wasn't really even a thing. The term had just been invented not long before the movement happened. And so for people to work across these boundaries of national origin, of language, of generation, of politics, to be able to find common cause in Chol Soo Lee, I think there's something that certainly I find incredibly inspiring about it. I think just that's sort of what set Julie and I on this path. And I think we're just thrilled that this story is sort of able to be out there to kind of help fill out this presence that we have in this country with a history like this.
Speaking of that enormous pain in childhood, I just wonder if we can maybe have a little conversation. We have about 5 minutes. I might want to get to another question or two, but what are the effects of immigration? What were the effects of immigration on Chol Soo Lee? And Maysee, maybe we'll start with you and say, what kind of effects are you seeing from your perch in terms of immigration and refugee resettlement of the Asian diaspora coming here, particularly in the Hmong community that you've seen and witnessed?
That's it's such a big question. But I can say that I guess the thing that I thought about was the education, education that's received by kids in schools, and just being able to get the support that one needs in order to thrive and do well and be successful. One needs that, someone who can identify with one's culture and one's language to some degree. I think about Chol Soo and how he was going to school, and because of the language barrier, the cultural barrier, there was, I think he said that there was, they were teaching in Chinese, and really catering towards the Chinese students, which was fine for those students. But just because we're all Asian doesn't necessarily mean we can all identify with every one of us, or that's the school is going to be taught in a way that's adapted for all of us, and that he acted out as a result of just trying to be understood and being seen, and that attention that he needed. So I see that very much having had happened also in the Hmong community, over the years, most certainly when I was growing up. And I think we're starting to do a better job, in terms of understanding that and trying to meet students where they're at, and providing them the support that they need. But, we still have a long ways to go as well.
Yeah. There's a great question here that maybe will be kind of something that we end with. The question is, how can we apply the learnings from Chol Soo Lee from his life to today's issues? So, what does his story teach us today? And maybe what is there a through line? Are we seeing rhythms and rhymes from that movement into today's movements that we're seeing, be it Me Too or Black Lives Matter or Stop Asian Hate, or all these sort of movements we're having? Are you seeing teachings from Chol Soo Lee's story? And let's start with Eugene.
I mean, I think there's certainly an experience that all racialized people and all poor have in this country. There's certainly an experience that all people who are lower on the socioeconomic ladder have in this country. But I think there's a specificity that I think comes to mind right now when you ask this and in the context of this conversation. Because someone mentioned Yuri Kochiyama and her solidarity with Malcolm X in one of the comments, which is just one of these incredible sort of facts that you're just amazed to learn. And there are so many ways that sort of all of our communities can connect. One thing that we talked about, the No Angel line that starts the film. That was often how that was how Michael Brown was described. Michael Brown, whose death happened in Ferguson, and in many ways was seminal to sort of getting so much of the modern day activism going when it comes to police misconduct. And so, we often say that these issues affect us all, all as Americans. If you're the wrong color, if you're the wrong class, if you're just in the wrong place, this can just happen to you. And so to be able to find that solidarity, to be able to reach across and find an unlikely solidarity, to go back to that word again, just as folks did back then, Korean and Japanese people didn't really get along historically, but they found common cause. And to be able to sort of use that as inspiration, to find those solidarities today to sort of attack and address what might be out there that is sort of weighing on our hearts, is just something that stays with me.
Julie?
I think, I always say, I think it's important to personalize the lessons of this film and this story. And I think for each person, it's going to be different. We've been fortunate to have shared the film quite a bit with audiences. And, some people see it as an indictment of our criminal justice system. For some people, it's eye-opening to even think about that, yes, people, it makes them even think about, even today, people are getting wrongfully convicted. It also makes them think about what happens when you're incarcerated, even if you did commit the crime. Is this the kind of system and the kind of values that we want to uphold as a society? And so it makes people think about that. I think also, because we're living through a time of this horrible spate in anti-Asian violence, I think what we're seeing too is that people are connecting the dots between the anti-Asian racism that occurred with the Chol Soo Lee case, and even long before that, and connecting the dots to what's happening now. Sometimes I've been shocked when I've heard people, say like, oh, wow, I didn't even realize like anti-Asian racism existed until the violence that they're seeing now. And I think people just dismissed the racism against us as like microaggressions that we would experience. And so it's, in a way, like this film also helps show that we have a long history of that kind of racism in our community and in our country. But we also would hope that people take incredible inspiration from how Asian Americans responded to this racism and this injustice. They stood up to the most powerful institution in this country, the criminal justice system. And they said, you did wrong and we're going to right this wrong. And this was a 6-year-long movement, to help a stranger, to help somebody who was not a model minority. And I think that's often the part that brings me to tears, that this group dedicated years of their lives and their hearts and souls to somebody who was not some undergrad at Berkeley. He was actually somebody who had a criminal record, who was essentially a street kid. But again, they deemed him worthy, of this landmark movement.
Yeah, and Maysee, you have any closing thoughts on that?
There are lots of questions in the comments about storytelling. And so I couldn't help it. I just hope that this does some justice. I don't know if it does it or doesn't. But I think if anything, this film also makes me realize that, we need to be able to tell our stories the way that makes sense to us, and just be truthful about it. It's not always going to be pretty. We're not all full of angels, or we're not all devils. And we need to tell the stories that make sense to us in our perspective. And those who are ready to hear it will hear it. And those, if they have questions, they will ask. Those who are ready will. And so, if anything, I just wanted to leave us with that thought, at least.
It's beautiful. I got to sneak this in because I'm curious about this too. Someone asked about the retrial, and obviously Chol Soo won this retrial, I believe, on habeas corpus grounds, or was able to get to the retrial. Was the jury diverse in his retrial? Do we know anything about the jury pool there?
It was more diverse than his first trial, where he got the wrongful conviction. So that's an interesting question. And we, I can't remember the entire jury pool in terms of their race, but we do know, like, actually KW Lee ended up interviewing a few of those jurors, and they were, a couple of them were people of color. One was African American, one was Latino, and it was so fascinating to hear their insights on why they thought Chol Soo was not guilty of this crime, and they understood, like, racial profiling and how people of other races don't necessarily distinguish their features and get them mixed up very easily. And yeah, actually a couple of those jurors, I think they ended up going to the retrial victory party with the activists. And so there are actually pictures of them at the party. But yeah, that's such a good point, though, in terms of diversity of juries as well.
Yeah, great questions from everyone. Unfortunately, that takes us to the end of today's event. A special thank you to our guests, Julie, Eugene, and Maysee, for being here. This has meant a lot to me, to our viewers. What an incredible conversation, an incredible film. We hope that this screening provided a deeper appreciation for the legacy of Chol Soo Lee and the Asian American grassroots justice movement. The film Free Chol Soo Lee premieres on Independent Lens and the PBS video app on April 24th, 9 p.m. Central, 10 p.m. Eastern. So folks, set your TVs, your TiVos, your DVRs. Again, the film premieres Independent Lens, April 24th, 9 p.m. Central local time. And just a note to everyone who's participating now, please take a few minutes to fill out a survey and share your feedback and thoughts with us. It really helps us organize this. It's invaluable in helping us understand the impact of the Indie Lens pop-up events. And everyone who completes the survey is entered into a raffle for a chance to win a $50 gift card. So there you go. And don't forget to sign up for updates on local events coming to PBS and the station throughout the season. And you can keep up to date on that by going to our website at milwaukeepbs.org and following us on our social media platforms. So again, a special thank you to our guests, to all of you participating, and to our national partners, Independent Lens, ITVS, PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and our local partners here at MATC, the Milwaukee Area Technical College. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Take care.